All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here for WPCTN's Lunch and Learn Breathless Voices Survivors in the Law on Strangulation. I'm Tabitha Robinson. I am the president of WPC. Again, thank you for being here this afternoon. Before we get started, I do want to mention that we have a fabulous event coming up. It is Movers and Movements. It will be at Harkin Hall on November 5th, so 1 week from now from 5:30 to 7 p.m. and we will be honoring Patricia Malone Smith, Julia Baker, Dot Dobbins posthumously, and the Tennessee Freedom Circle. So it's going to be a great event and we hope to see you there. More information on our website, wpctn.com. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to pass it off to Judge Allegra Walker. Judge Walker, thank you for being here. Take it away.
Well, thank you for having me, Tabitha. I have a long relationship with the Women's Political Collaborative, so I do enjoy any opportunity to be able to speak to everyone. Again, my name is Judge Allegra Walker. I am one of the 4 domestic violence judges here in Davidson County. The other judges who also preside along with me is Judge Marcus Floyd, Judge Anna Escobar, and Judge Robin Kimbrough Hayes. And we deal with all the domestic violence cases that are here in Davidson County. So it's a privilege to be able to serve with the 4 of the other justices. So today's topic is about strangulation, which is a very important topic. We are currently in Domestic Violence Awareness Month. We're at the end of the month. So this topic is very important. Domestic violence, about 1 in 4 women are victims of domestic violence. Of course, men are also victims of domestic violence as well, not at the rates that women are victims, but men are victims of domestic violence as well. So I did want to put that out there. Here in Davidson County, we see lots of domestic violence cases. So I am busy all day, every day, not today, but all day, every day. We see lots of domestic violence cases. It's about half of all crimes that are committed in Davidson County are domestic violence related. Now, prosecuting those cases, and we'll get into that later, can sometimes be a challenge, but about half of all cases of crime here in Davidson County are domestic violence related. So we can let that sink in for a moment. That's a lot of cases that come through the system. Now I'm going to ask a question before I get into the panel, and you can answer that in the chat. But I want to know, because this is a lunch and learn, so I want to know how many people that are present today have some working knowledge or experience even with domestic violence and or strangulation, which is also called aggravated assault by strangulation here in under the statute. So I'm interested to see how many people have some working knowledge or have been affected or have been a victim of domestic violence. And you can drop your comments if you feel comfortable with that in the chat. Now, we have some fabulous panelists today, and I'll get immediately into that, and I'll let them give a little 1 minute, 30-second blurb on who they are and what they do. I rarely introduce people. I love for people to introduce themselves because they get to tell the best of themselves and not leave that to me. So we will start with Becky Bullard.
Thank you so much, Judge Walker. Hi, everyone. My name is Becky Bullard, and I'm the Deputy Director of Programs at Metro Nashville's Office of Family Safety. Our office is a government office like police and fire is an office. We oversee our family safety centers here in Nashville. So I oversee our client services, which is advocacy and case management on site at both centers, as well as our training and technical assistance, and our high-risk programming response to interpersonal violence, which includes domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, child abuse, and vulnerable adult abuse. And I get to work with all these wonderful people in our response on strangulation and have been really excited to see the way that Nashville is focusing in on strangulation and have gotten to go to several different conferences and gained a lot of expertise for our strangulation response here in Nashville. So that's something I get to regularly train on across the country and testify as well as an expert witness on strangulation. So thank you, Judge, for having me today.
All right, moving on, Lieutenant, if you could introduce your name, introduce yourself to the audience and tell what you do.
Yes, ma'am. I'm Stephen Weir. I've been in criminal justice field for almost 20 years. The last 2 years have been um, in domestic violence division within the Metro Nashville Police Department. Our division takes part in interpersonal partner violence and also intimate partners, non-intimate partners. We have a high-risk panel that we coordinate with the FSC as far as our LAP forms or lethality assessment program, which focuses also on strangulation to bring up cases that are high risk. Also, we have a VAPIT team within our domestic violence division as well that focuses on vulnerable adult protective investigative team as far as elderly or anyone who's vulnerable as an adult as far as learning disabilities and such that they need a caretaker. So, and the judge is right, we get about 30,000, almost 30,000 cases, reports a year through domestic violence division. So it's quite an undertaking that our detectives go through day in and day out, but I'm proud to be a part of it.
All right, next, Miss Amani Foster, if you could introduce yourself, please.
Hi, everyone. I'm Amani Foster. I'm a current senior at Vanderbilt. I was also Judge Walker's intern for 2 summers. So that's how I've been able to meet her. I'll be talking about my experience with domestic violence during college. So I'll just be offering my thoughts on that and also just some reflections as I've entered the space of DV advocacy through Judge Walker and from my studies at Vanderbilt.
All right, and last but not least, General Christina Johnson, if you could introduce yourself, please, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Christina Johnson. I head the domestic violence unit at the district attorney's office. I moved into this position back in 2018 when I became a lawyer. So I spent about 20 years in marketing and television, and my life personally, not myself, but family members, has been affected by domestic violence. And I knew that I wanted to do something to support victims and survivors, and have been very grateful to have the opportunity to not only be a part of this unit, but to lead the unit of 21 individuals who serve the residents of Davidson County and try and support them on their journey to survivorhood. Thank you, Judge.
All right, you're welcome. Okay, we're going to get right into it. One thing I do want to let the audience know that domestic violence touches everybody, no matter what your race is, your religion, how much money you make, how much education you may have. Domestic violence is going to cut across all of that, and every one of us on this panel has seen that it cuts and nobody is really left out of that. So let's get right in it. General Johnson, if you could give a definition of domestic violence as well as the strangulation, which is also called aggravated assault, as it's seen and as it operates underneath the Tennessee statute.
Okay, so in Tennessee, domestic violence is a very, very wide spectrum. I think most of us think of it as what we call interpersonal violence, or boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife, but it's a lot broader than that. Here in Davidson County, it's anybody who's ever been a roommate, anybody who is related by blood or marriage or has been related by blood or marriage, siblings, and all of that. So there's a pretty big umbrella. So any act of violence that happens between somebody who has that relationship would be considered domestic violence. Now for strangulation, basically a strangulation or an attempted strangulation are both defined the same way in Tennessee, which means just applying pressure to an individual's neck or covering their nose and their mouth to impede their regular breathing. And it's important to say that an attempted strangulation is also a strangulation, because a completed strangulation would ultimately more than likely end up in a homicide. So that was an important word that was used by the Tennessee legislators. So I'm grateful for that. There are additional penalties for strangulation if a victim is pregnant, or if the victim loses consciousness during a strangulation. Those become more stricter penalties, and that was changed by the legislators in, I want to say, 2023.
Okay. So, and here's a question, it's a deeper dive, and sorry for throwing this out there, but I'm just curious, with the change of the legislation, would you say, and Becky, you may chime in, or Lieutenant may chime in as well, with the change of the legislation with the aggravated assault by strangulation, do you think that there have been fewer cases, more cases, no change in cases?
Well, cases have definitely jumped up. I don't think that that's because of the change in law. I don't think the abusers are studying the law and seeing that something's changed and decided, like, oh, I want to do this now. I think that, domestic abuse definitely happens far before the first bruise ever was shown up, and definitely far before there was ever a strangulation attempt. I was personally involved in that legislation change, and meeting with different people out on the Capitol to make sure that happened. And the primary goal, at least on my end, was to make sure that women who I would consider even more vulnerable when they're pregnant, it's taken into consideration that they are in the process of creating a life, and so strangling somebody when they're pregnant was egregious and something that I was seeing frequently, but it was being charged just the same as somebody who wasn't. So I was grateful for that change.
So essentially, it gives a district attorney more tools in their toolbox to prosecute cases like this.
And I think prosecute them correctly. I mean, I think it's important that we're careful on how we prosecute. So yes.
So how common do you find in your caseload, and I'm there with you most days, how common do you find in your caseload with domestic violence, the strangulation piece of that?
Strangulation happens every single day. As you know, Judge, we have multiple strangulations on every single docket, every single day. Abusers are not that creative, and strangulation is a tool of control. It is, in my opinion, the most powerful tool of control that an abuser can use. Saying, I have your life in my hands unless you do what I am expecting of you, is an extremely powerful tool. And it's something that we see, unfortunately, every day.
Mm-hmm. Lieutenant, and I'm going to throw this out here as well, and Becky, you're probably in position to answer this question as well. When people talk about strangulation, and just taking from what General Johnson just said, when somebody has their hand around your neck, how many pounds of pressure does it take for that strangulation to then turn into murder? Because it's very little. I forgot the actual number, but Lieutenant or Becky, who knows that answer to that question?
3 to 5 pounds for strangulation, essentially the same amount of pressure it would take to pull the trigger on a firearm. That's about the same amount of pressure it would take to stop the blood flow on someone's neck.
So I'm going to repeat that for our audience, just so we can put proper context around the seriousness of strangulation. Lieutenant just told you all that it takes 3 to 5 pounds of pressure for a strangulation to then become a homicide. That is the same amount of pressure that it would take you to pull this trigger on a gun. So that's actually very little pressure, and that's why this crime is so serious, and one of the reasons why we're bringing some spotlight to that today, so everybody can better educate themselves on how serious this is, and govern themselves accordingly. I think, Lieutenant, why have you here with me? Talk about the training that is involved with dealing with domestic violence and strangulation cases?
So our officers undergo domestic violence training once a year, especially through in-service training. We also do roll call training. We just recently sent out a roll call training for our new, it's called the 117 form and a lap form, update to that has highlighted strangulation as bringing up the question further up on the lap form. So if there's a yes to that question, it automatically brings them to into a high-risk panel. We also train our officers and detectives that like Judge spoke about how lethal strangulation can be. There are certain factors that officers can take into account to charge them with attempted homicide. So it could be the position of the defendant during the strangulation, the multiple strangulations that occur during one incident. And those are just some of the factors an officer can take into account and then appropriately charge them with attempted homicide. And then the FSC also helps us with a lot of training as well. Becky does a great job putting on a presentation, and when we send our roll call training out, a video from the FSC was incorporated with that roll call training to give people an idea, if a victim has been strangled, some of the stats that were in this roll call training, a victim has been strangled, they're at 750% increased risk of homicide by their partner. And 10% of all violent deaths are attributed to strangulation. Those are just some of the stats that were incorporated in our roll call training.
All right, so let's slow that down for our listening audience because they may be sipping on their coffee right now and didn't catch that. So how much more risk do you have to be killed if you've been strangled? You said 700, some percentage.
750%.
How much?
750% increased risk of homicide by their partner.
750% increased risk of death by your intimate partner if strangulation is involved in the relationship. Is that correct?
And
That's
I would
mind
add
blowing.
to that, Judge, there's some new research too that's shown that with repeated strangulation and strangulation where you lose consciousness, that risk increases even more, up to 1,000% risk. So we're learning more and more about strangulation as a lethality marker and how important it is for everyone to receive training. And I know Lieutenant Weir spoke to the training for police, and that's something we have really tried to do since 2017 is saturate our field in understanding of strangulation, because the crime is on one hand so lethal, on another hand really complicated. It's complicated to identify, it's complicated to prove in court, it's complicated to help someone plan for their safety when they know they're at such high risk. So it's my strong opinion that if we're doing work on domestic violence, on sexual assault, on human trafficking, vulnerable adult abuse, and even child abuse, we're seeing strangulation in all those crimes. Anyone who is doing this work, whether it's patrol getting information on roll calls, our advocates getting trained, our prosecutors, our court personnel, everyone needs to have training on strangulation.
I agree. And you all do. When Becky says they saturate the field, they saturate the field. And you all do a great job at doing that. Becky, while I have you present with us, let's talk about the medical impact of strangulation, short-term, long-term health consequences of strangulation that you all see with survivors. And then I also want to ask you about, I think there's a misnomer out there about nobody saw any marks. I didn't do it because there were no marks left on her neck. So let's go into those two topics.
So you're absolutely right. The typical thing that people are looking for when they think of a strangulation is marks on the neck. And what we see in the research and in the clients that we see here in the Family Safety Center is only 50% of the time are we going to see visible injury from strangulation. And then only 15% of the time can you actually photograph that injury. And that goes down even more for people of color whose injuries might not show up in the same way. So we need to be really particular in our investigations and our advocacy and the prosecutions that we do on strangulation to note beyond visible injury, strangulation is also going to have what we call symptoms. And those symptoms can range from a number of non-visible indicators, like neurological symptoms. So you can see stroke-like symptoms happening. You can see dizziness. We've had several people who've come into the center very dizzy, very nauseated, vomiting, and really impacted in that symptomatic way from a strangulation. The most common thing that we see symptomatically on that kind of immediate medical impact is changes in voice and breathing. So we'll often have clients who have a very raspy voice, their voice is changing, they have coughing, they have difficulty swallowing, which can last, these voice changes can last for some time because that neck is so vulnerable. What Lieutenant Weir had mentioned with the amount of pressure it takes to just occlude the carotid artery, which is that, 4 pounds of pressure, that can cause more internal damage than you would think because we have such vulnerability in the neck. So those voice changes, difficulty breathing, that kind of stridor breath are things that we can see in the short term. And then in the long term, you can see a number of internal injuries that are impacting the person over the long haul. You can see pregnancy loss. That's something I'm glad General Johnson brought up our change that we worked on in statute to make sure that we're able to have increased prosecution around that and increased accountability when the victim is pregnant. We can see that pregnancy result in a loss because of the strangulation. We can also see traumatic brain injuries that impact that person because a strangulation is what we call an insult to the brain. It's an anoxic injury that is impacting the brain's ability to function. And then the final long-term impact we can see is when someone has what's called a carotid dissection. And that's when that pressure to the carotid artery makes it dissect. And you can see that dissection breaking off and going to the brain or the lungs. And that can be anywhere from a week, 2 weeks, a month, up to a year after a strangulation. That if that dissection, that clot breaks off, it can cause a stroke in that individual and they could die. So a lot of impacts. I know that was a lot of information, but lots of short term that we see and then long term that we may never see.
Did you go into, Becky, the symptoms with the eyes as a result of strangulation? Did you talk about that?
So that is one of the visible injuries that we might see is petechia. And so I know Judge Walker and we worked at the district attorney's office many years ago, and we didn't have all of the information around strangulation that we have now. And I know that was something that we looked for when we were working together is the impact to that person's eyes, whether there are these red dots around or inside the eye. So that was a common thing that we were looking at for visible injury. And you can see petechia in cases. It typically forms around anywhere from 15 seconds, 10 to 15 seconds of that person putting continuous pressure. You can see petechia develop. However, you can see cases, even cases that end in death, where there's no petechia. And it's just all about the obstruction of blood flow and when that can occur. We can see petechia that happens internally in the mouth, in the ears, and even under the scalp and above the scalp. So petechia can be an indicator that helps us understand the strangulation.
Okay. All right. All right, moving on. Ms. Foster, I'm just curious in terms of your experience, your personal experience with domestic violence in the system. If you could go in, not necessarily go into that, but how was your experience dealing with the criminal justice system in your jurisdiction with respect to your personal situation?
I think it was dealing with it in the system was a different experience than I thought it would be. So I had a notion of how prosecution was for domestic violence just coming from my area, which I'm from Ohio. So it's, in the north, Ohio, much different than Davidson County, where I'm from in Lucas County. And so I kind of had a lot of fear going into it because I've never spoken to a prosecutor. I've never met with a prosecutor. I might have had a certain notion of a prosecutor as someone going into law and prosecutor versus public defender conversation. And so I think that I was, for my experience, having women of color on my case was very important for me. And when I saw that when I first got into the meeting, that was a breath of fresh air because I was terrified. I didn't know if what side I would be on, like as far as, if someone would be blaming me because that had started, or if, the other person had very good lawyers. So I was very in the mix of everything. And so seeing women of color on my case was definitely a breath of fresh air. I think that I can't speak to the other resources as far as like the DV shelter and the Family Safety Center because I didn't interact with those pieces because I had this incident happen on campus. So we have all of those resources on campus. But from what I've seen through my internship, the way that things are more siloed is something that I think is really good to see compared to college resources where things are more fragmented, and dealing with domestic violence on college campuses is a very complex issue that still needs fixing, in which that's what I've started to work on since my experience in navigating it on a college campus. But I think that overall it was very quick, which I was very specific in asking for. Um, I do feel like I had a lot of privacy, which I was also very specific in asking for. And I think for what I've noticed for my case compared to other women that I've seen their cases be tried with Judge Walker is sometimes that being vocal is not what all women bring to their case, rightfully so, because it's a very emotional and traumatic experience. For me, I was very vocal about wanting privacy, wanting it to be quick, wanting to go back to school, and for this to be pushed aside legally, at least. Obviously, the social and emotional things are still going on, but I wanted this all to be done out in the courtroom and as quick as possible. So because I was very vocal with that, I think it worked well with the prosecutor and I of making sure that that came to fruition. But overall, I would say that I really liked that it was quick, it was accessible, and everything that I asked for as far as my more personal wishes were definitely given. Um, but again, I think there are more factors as far as it happening on a university campus, there being a lot of entities involved with it that put a lot of focus versus it being, one of the thousands of cases in Davidson County that may not have been pushed through as quickly.
Mhm. I do, and just one takeaway from what you said, and I used to prosecute domestic violence in the district attorney's office for about 6 years, and I did find that me being a African American female was very, very helpful in the prosecution when I was dealing with African American females. And I thought as well, we had men and there are men in the district attorney's office as well. So I felt like men in the DA's office too, not an easier time, but it was a level of comfort that a lot of victims felt where there were men as well. So that having a diverse prosecutions team is very helpful because you're going to be dealing with diverse people from the community, and everybody's going to will be able to find their person and their level of comfort as a result. So I get that. I'm going to do a deeper dive with you, Amani, while we have you. What steps would you find that would better protect victims of domestic violence? That would be either personally, and seem like you had a decent run with the system personally, or since you've been in the justice system for over a year now and you've seen all these cases, what things would you suggest would better protect women that are victims of domestic violence or persons that are victims of domestic violence? Because it's not just women.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, well, the first thing is as I reflect back my relationship with my ex, there were certain red flags as in behaviors that could point to forms of violence, whether emotional violence, verbal, then leading to domestic violence. More young women need to have education around behaviors that are accepted. And we were talking about this before the panel started, but behaviors that are condoned that are actually forms of violence. I think that looking back, there were so many very subtle conversations, very subtle times together that pointed to, how this person might have felt about domestic violence, how this person might have felt about what control looked like, what relationships, all of those things. And so, but again, like this happened when I was 19 and like I'm 21 now, so still very fresh in the dating world. But I have
Very
a new,
fresh, by the
very
way.
fresh, very, and we've talked about that, but very fresh. But I'm saying like I've developed a new eye of those things that I previously didn't have. But it took like me being strangled in a very serious domestic violence situation to then have that third sense. And so for me, as I've joined my sorority and started to join more groups with young women around my age and into more DV advocacy, I've been very vocal about, well, how can we educate women more, especially young women, on behaviors that are actually unacceptable? Because one thing I noticed through my internship is so many women saying, oh, I've been with this person for 5 years and they've never been physical with me, but they do this and they did this and they would, and so that kind of helped kind of give me comfort as in knowing that, me missing out on those emotional and verbal abuses, that's a very common experience. And that wasn't just out of me being ignorant, but just simply being uneducated of things that were acceptable and unacceptable. And that's due to cultural beliefs, due to societal beliefs, due to social media, all of those things. So
All
I
those.
think, yeah, all of those things. It's very complex. So yeah, I think that's one thing is like educating young women specifically.
Okay.
Yeah,
All right. Well, I'm going to expound on that. I have these questions, but I can talk this stuff all day long. So I'll go into different, you know,
absolutely.
little tunnels, if you will, and expand. General Johnson, Amani talked about some of those red flags. Expound on the red flags. What are some of those methods of power and control that an abuser they'll exhibit throughout relationships?
So I think a lot of times we get used to sort of treating the symptoms
Mhm.
instead of what's actually the root, right? And I don't think that these people who are perpetuating domestic violence, I don't I don't think it's about the anger. I don't think it's about the alcohol. I don't think it's about all of these other symptoms, right? The mental health condition or this, that, and the other. Most of the time, it is a deliberate strategy to
Mhm.
infiltrate somebody else's mind and colonize it, right? Kind of just take over their mind, right? And then they manipulate and use love as a tactic to for obedience, right? So the abuse that they're doing is not just an act of rage, it's a deliberate strategic move that they are making to control this person, to sustain that obedience to them, right? And so with that, going back into the strangulation, again, why I think it's the favorite tool of abusers is because it is a deliberate, thoughtful act. It is a thoughtful act to say, I will dominate you, right? I have control here, and the other person is at a complete lack of control. I think that a lot of times we think that there's an uncontrollable rage and somebody just turns into the Hulk. And I don't know that I buy that. I think that most of the time it's a strategy for dominion and control. When you're talking about the control patterns, there's so many of them, right? Whether it's manipulating the finances, whether it's manipulating who you can see, who you can be friends with, who you can't be friends with. Um, uh, if it's using your immigration status, which we're seeing right now just horrifically, right? The people that live in my community in South Nashville, like my fellow Hispanic people, we are not calling the police. because then all these other things are going to happen, right? So we have seen a huge decline in our Latino reporting in domestic violence in court. So immigration status, financial status, using the kids, using the threats of if you're a particular religion that might look down on divorce or something like that. There's all of these different tactics and control devices that these abusers can use. And again, I don't think it's any mistake when they choose to use what they're going to choose to use. They have colonized your brain. They have taken over that little part of you, and they know what matters to you most. So what matters to Amani and what matters to me may be very different. I will do anything and go anywhere and do anything I need for my kids. And I know Amani doesn't have kids yet, but hers might be her education, might be her future. So they're going to pick and choose what they want to do. So I hope that answers your question.
It does.
And
I
I
want
can
to do
talk
an
about
ad
this all day long too, Judge
all day
Walker.
long.
And going off of that, when I had the first kind of like intake interview, I remember being very vocal about, well, this is the first time that this happened or this came out of nowhere. While yes, the physical act came out of nowhere, but as 2 years later, as I'm coming to a different level of consciousness about the situation, the control had started from day one. And that's also where I had less guilt and I had a lot of guilt of, oh, I shouldn't have called the police, or I should have just, called, whatever, my mom or something instead of the police. Like I shouldn't have escalated this, whatever it may be. But I have a different understanding now where it's like this level of control and abuse has always been there. The wanting to know who's in my phone, the wanting to know where I'm going, why I was, doing this, doing that. It's been going on since the dawn of time in the relationship. And so that's a different understanding that I have now that I didn't previously have. I was so hell-bent that this was so out of the blue when the different levels of control have been persisting since the beginning.
Also, and you mentioned the cell phone. Cell phones are 100% all day, every day. We see this in court. It's the control over the text messages. Who are you texting? You must be cheating. Why are you on the phone so long? It's all about that cell phone and the contact. It's about throwing the cell phone, punching the walls. It's about all those things. So you mentioned something, Amani, and you mentioned it's the first time you had the guilt of calling the police and things like that. What was your experience with victim blaming? Because we see it all day long. You'll see on social media, things will happen, to people, I guess, famous folks or just whatever comes out in social media. And the comments get to rolling. I mean, the comments are brutal. And these folks don't even know these people. But what's been your experience with victim blaming, if any?
So that was probably one of the most traumatic parts aside from the actual act. So my incident, my boyfriend, he was an athlete. And so there was also like the academic side of attaching my university to this incident, and then this person being an athlete of that university. And so kind of there was a level of hierarchy of like, oh, well, this person is an athlete that has these different protections, and then I'm right here. Very separate from that, a Black woman from, not from this whatsoever. And so the victim blaming was it was extreme, especially when there's certain outlets that take all these cases and they put all the details and all the case facts online for everyone to see. So my name was not mentioned in things like the Tennessean, although the incident was in Tennessean, it was in ESPN, a lot of big outlets, but my name was mentioned in the more local things. And so that led to a lot of harassment online, a lot of victim blaming, especially with how the police report was written, was in a way problematic in itself. And so then when that got to the public, everything was translated over and then even more, circled back around to something that was also not accurate. And so the victim blaming was intense, absolutely. And it also costed me a lot of social consequences as far as seeing that narrative that's still out there today online. I kind of say that it was my introduction to the world that was very unfair. I didn't want, when you look up my name to see strangulation, this, and that by ex-boyfriend. I don't want that at all. And so that was kind of a result of that. And so that's why I had a lot of regret, not regret, but a lot of self-blame and a lot of guilt for calling the police or for maybe giving the police details that were just external context to it, because that then got out to, the wrong people.
Got it.
Mhm.
All right. Lieutenant, um, we just got through mentioning police. In terms of investigating domestic violence and you all having this initial contact with victims of domestic violence, like what are some of the things that in terms of the officer training, what are some of the things that officers are trying to extricate from victims in order to be able to do a good prosecution of a case?
Well, first off, we try and separate the parties. We don't want, we spoke about control earlier. The suspect can still control a victim from across the room with just a glance or a glare, and the victim would be reluctant to speak. So we do try and separate the parties, get both sides of the story, try and develop probable cause without victim cooperation, because a lot of times, like we spoke about before, the suspect is in control, the victim's reluctant to want to prosecute, whether it be through the suspect or through victim blaming or anything like that, anything that would prevent them from telling us exactly what happened. We have a 117 form also that helps document injuries, where they occurred. We try not to lean too much on injuries themselves, because sometimes injuries can be defensive. So if the suspect has, a bite mark on his chest and the victim doesn't have any injuries, the only reason a bite mark would occur on the chest is because he was had her in a headlock or something like that. So we try and encompass the history between the parties as well. Is there a domestic history between them? What are the injuries? Are the stories consistent? And we try it when it comes to strangulation. A lot of times, there can be a misconception that the story is inconsistent, but in reality, the victim doesn't realize that they lost consciousness, because there is memory loss that comes along with that. So asking all the right questions as far as around strangulation and trying to put all the pieces together, so if the victim doesn't want to cooperate, that we can prosecute on their behalf.
Okay. General Johnson, with respect to the prosecution, I know that it is often challenging. Talk about some of the challenges of prosecuting domestic violence cases that you and your team experience on a day-to-day basis.
Okay, so the biggest challenge, I think, bar none, is a lack of participation from the listed victim, right? So more frequently than not, domestic violence happens in the privacy of, a location. And the only witness to the assault is the actual victim. By the time the police arrive, more likely than not, the defendant has already left. So the police are obtaining their probable cause based on the evidence that they are presented with. And what is that evidence? That evidence is what the victim says. Her voice, I'm saying her because it is what it is. Her voice is the evidence. So when it comes time for court and the victim, for whatever reason, is unable or unwilling to participate in the process, her voice, AKA her evidence, is not there. and we have no evidence to present. So that is by far the biggest hurdle that we run into. Now, there are some cases where we can figure out ways to get her voice in, even with her not there, but that is not the norm. So the norm is what I previously described.
And just so everybody knows, in the audience, the district attorney's office does prosecute. It's not the norm because of the circumstances that they face. It's not the norm, but they can and will prosecute cases where the victim is not present. There are ways you can do that legally in their little toolbox, but they can and they will prosecute cases where there is no victim. And to be honest, a lot of times, defendants will do themselves in because when they are in jail, they often cannot control their mouths on the cell phone, on the jail phone. So they will often call victims from jail and have these crazy conversations, totally implicating themselves and them asking people not to come. And, can you go get my sister downtown to go do this, go do that, just to make sure she didn't come. So that does happen, and that's a win-win, I think, for the prosecution when you can put it together. And I sit often on the bench shaking my head, like as many times as people tell folks to stay off the phones in jail, they are on the phones talking. So I just want everybody to know it can happen, and it does. Not a lot, but it does happen. All right, Becky, and we're almost ready to round off the last 12, 13 minutes of this panel. But in terms of resources, Office of Family Safety is, it's resource haven. Everything and anything is up underneath the umbrella of the Office of Family Safety. Tell about some of the resources that are out there available for folks who are victims of domestic violence.
Absolutely. So we have 2 family justice centers in Nashville. Family justice centers are basically your one-stop shop for the services that you need if you've experienced abuse. So think of it as your target for everything in one place. So you've got civil legal services, you have advocacy, case management, therapy. If you choose to speak with a detective, we can help facilitate that. But that's a choice. That's something that a victim or survivor coming to be our client might say, I would like to speak with a detective, and we would facilitate that for them. And then there are many people say, I do not want to speak with police, and that's absolutely fine. And that's something that's important for us in our confidentiality. The same thing goes with our prosecutor's office. We have a center in the courthouse that's there really for those individuals who are court involved. They are coming in for an order of protection, for a criminal case, and they can receive services from our advocacy staff while they're also speaking with the district attorney or maybe their civil legal attorney about their order of protection or their criminal case. The types of services that we provide and that all of our partners provide are, like you said, it's kind of just everything under the sun. We want to make sure that people come in and they lead us with their needs. So if they come in and they say, I need food, that's what we're going to prioritize, right? If they say, my primary need is shelter, we're going to be working with them on how we get them into one of Nashville's shelters or how we look at transitional housing that they can access. With strangulation specifically, we've been really intentional over the last several years in building up Nashville's resources on strangulation. So we provide a lot of education to our clients who come to the centers around strangulation. We also do a danger assessment, which is related to the lethality assessment the police do. But the danger assessment is longer. It asks some more in-depth questions about strangulation. And that gives us the ability to really start walking them through why we're concerned about strangulation, the medical impacts, and some of the lethality, what that means for this person who's abusing them, and continued violence. So we do a lot of education and a lot of safety planning. And that's really helpful for our clients to leave with those tools in their toolbox. And there's one more thing that I'm really excited that we're adding to the Family Safety Center as a resource, and it's really particular to strangulation. We're going to start offering forensic exams for domestic violence here on site at the Family Safety Center. That's in partnership with our office, Office of Family Safety, Metro Public Health Department, and Metro Nashville General Hospital. So we're hoping that will roll out in the new year in 2026. And what that will go to is the prosecution information that we need, the investigative information that we need, so that we're not placing the weight of the criminal justice system and holding the offender accountable on the victim. We're also bringing in as much information as we can from a medical perspective, from an investigative perspective, from those lovely jail calls you mentioned, just bringing it all together to show that we have all of this evidence that we can present and try to move that through without kind of putting the target on that victim's back. So we're really excited about that, both for the investigative improvement and for the medical improvement that will provide for our clients, because many of our clients don't want to go to the emergency department. So making sure they have some medical services on site is really exciting.
I'm sure you all worked very hard to get that. And I know Diane Lance, who is your fearless leader over at the Office of Family Safety, is very excited and over the moon about that value add to your business. All right, so we're about to round out. I'm going to ask one more question in the meantime, in between time. If you all in the audience have a question that you'd like for them to answer, feel free to do that over into the chat, and then I will get some of those questions and we can talk about in the last 5 minutes or so of the program. I think I wanted to go into I think I wanted to quickly go into misconceptions that people have about. No, I think I already talked about that. Hold tight. I had all these questions written down. And we talked about that as well. I think we talked about everything that I want to talk about today and then some more. Let me do this. Let me go on any takeaways that our panelists may have. Lieutenant Weir, I'll start with you. What are some of the takeaways that you want everybody to know that you may not have hit or that you may want to reemphasize?
Yeah, I think empowerment is important. You know, interpersonal crimes is probably one of the least reported crimes that we get. Domestic violence is one of those. So how do we empower and educate victims to feel comfortable coming forward? You know, don't label a relationship just as controlling or toxic. It is domestic abuse. And, you know, feel comfortable to come to the police department to report these incidents. Unfortunately, a large portion, almost 75% of our domestic homicides have no domestic history. We know that's not because domestic violence didn't occur. It's because they didn't feel comfortable coming forward, or we weren't aware of it because it happened. Maybe they have history in a different jurisdiction. But I think empowerment and education and allowing victims to feel comfortable to reach out for services, even if it's not prosecution, reach out for other services through the Office of Family Safety. There are ways to get out of this abusive relationship, the cycle of violence, and not allow the suspect to control you, and without police involvement, if that's really what the goal is.
Lieutenant, how many domestic violence murders did we have in the county this past year? I know we had the bridge event a couple of weeks ago, and I forgot that number. Do you know it offhand?
We have 18 this year. It's a significant increase from last year. So, and
last year's number was how many?
12.
So we've gone from 12 murders, domestic violence related murders, up to 18 this year. And that's, is this calendar year, January
year to date? So we still have several months left.
Oh my goodness. And currently, Tennessee ranks, is it number 5 in the country? I know we stay in the top 10. Tennessee's, are we number 5, Becky? What number?
The most recent, the Violence Policy Center, the most recent number they were able to release was not, that was a ways back. It was for 2020 numbers, and we finally inched our way out of the top 10. We were 11, but we typically were at 5, 6, and over the 25 years they collected those numbers, we were in the top 10, 20 out of those 25 years.
Right. I knew that we stay in the top 10, which is, I don't know. I just have no words for it. And I've been in the business for 25 years, and I literally still have no words for why we in Tennessee, we just really just can't figure it out. And the legislation sometimes that we're provided to use, sometimes it's helpful and sometimes it's not. It's not all that helpful. Becky, since I have you on, do you have any takeaways that you'd like everybody to know?
I think, Lieutenant, we're bringing up the homicide rate. We're really concerned with what we're seeing with that increase. And I think that's something that we should all be aware of. And to Amani's point about talking with young people early on about what are red flags and what are green flags. What are the things that we should expect from a healthy, supportive, loving relationship? And what are those things that we should pique our interest when they're happening that first day? As she said, it was there from the beginning. It's very hard to see. Like Christina said, these people are manipulators. People who are using abuse are using it as a means of control. So how do we start educating our young people around those red flags? I think that's a really, really important point that I just wanted to highlight that Amani brought up. And then the final thing, because Judge, I know you might want me to mention this as we were talking about before, is the normalization of strangulation. So we see another kind of saturation of strangulation normalized in the media, in TV shows, and unfortunately in pornography, which is highly accessible for our young people. And when we have a co-occurrence of the highest time where you see domestic violence happening from 16 years old to 24-year-olds, those are our biggest group of people who are experiencing domestic abuse. And then a normalization of strangulation among young people as a part of intimate relationships, as a part of sex, even kissing. We're seeing cases where people are inhibiting breathing or putting pressure on the neck in a consensual way. However, the problem with that is that we can't, control what happens internally when there's pressure put on the neck. That's a really concerning trend that we're starting to see, that over 60% of women and transgender individuals have experienced strangulation as a part of sex. And that's just in 2023. That's doubled in its prevalence just in 2 years.
It's interesting you say that. I need to hurry up and wrap up, but I just can't help myself. You said the biggest group of age group that experiences domestic violence is that 16 to 24-year-old age group. And then you also mentioned the 60% of women and transgender women experience strangulation as a part of sex. After I went to a conference and learned more about strangulation with sex, I immediately went to go talk to my 18-year-old at the time. I think she may have been 17, actually. She knew all about this. The kids talk about it. Kids that were sexually active were engaged with strangulation as a part of sex, and it totally blew my mind that I had a 17-year-old that was knowledgeable about what kids are doing out in these streets with respect to sex and strangulation. So all of you all who have young girls, pull up a chair, ladies and gentlemen, and you all need to have a conversation today. So that's my takeaway. Amani, what's your takeaway from today?
My takeaway is a more personal reflection, but victims have to give themselves grace for what they might have asked for when their case was first being brought to where they may be today. So now, 2 years later, that I have all of this education and understanding of the system, I can't say that what I asked for in the beginning of quickness and privacy and for this not to be prosecuted to the highest potential, I can't say that that's what I would have asked for if this would have happened to me in the current state that I'm in now, with the education and knowledge that I have and the seriousness of this. And that is something that I've had to come to terms with and not forgive myself for, but more so come to terms with of I didn't understand the seriousness. I didn't understand that this was something that had been happening in a certain form continuously, that this abuse was happening throughout the relationship. But again, I didn't know that, I didn't have that knowledge then. I have that now. And so that's why when I do come and see women who have dealt with domestic violence, or I see that within my community, I'm very vocal about that, my personal story of, yeah, when this first happened to me, I didn't understand how serious this was and the long-lasting consequences of it. And now I do. So this is my story to you, to let you know that, you want this to be done quick, fast, in a hurry today, but think about what your future self might want when you get past all the initial trauma.
Got it. And we are officially 1 minute over time. General Johnson, if you can give a less than 30-second takeaway, and if everybody in our audience can put in the chat if they learned something today, if they increase their level of understanding about domestic violence and strangulation, if you could just have that so we'll know that we've done something helpful today. Take it away, Christina.
I concur with everything everybody else said. We need to keep talking about this. And if anybody on this chat is in a domestic violence relationship, understand, just like it didn't start overnight, I understand it doesn't stop overnight. I would encourage you to take little micro steps to create your own autonomy, whether it's driving a different way to work or buying the grapes that he doesn't like, or changing the day that you do the laundry. Just those little steps of autonomy will help you rewire your brain and make it feel safer. So that's all we want at the end of the day, is just to make sure everybody's safe at home. Thank you.
All right, well, we're going to end. Thank you for the Women's Political Collaborative for always bringing us very relevant issues to discuss in the community during this lunch and learn. Hope you all had a little something good to eat. I have not, but I'm about to in just one moment. Thanks to all the panelists. You guys are great. Always come through for me whenever I call. So I appreciate you dearly. And we will see you all later. Thank you.